year is 1929, and the stock market has just crashed, dropping a historic $30 billion in 1 week. Panic selling deluges the market as people's savings are squandered into nothingness. In desperation, the Smoot-Hawley Act attempts to save the prosperity of the 20s. Alas, it is a lost cause. The Tariff Act of 1930 will forever be known as a failure of economic diplomacy.
Although the Depression is often characterized as beginning on the day of the stock market collapse of October 29, 1929, the many roots of it span early into the Roaring Twenties. Loose credit and a booming economy meant that much spending was done on loans. Citizens were encouraged to buy now and pay later for the good of capitalism. Even stocks could be bought on margin. What resulted was a large, unstable credit bubble just waiting to be popped. And pop it did. As demand for appliances tapered off while production continued to remain constant, the prices began to drop dramatically. Companies were forced to fire their workers in order to cut expenses, and workers were left in debt with no income. Banks started recalling loans and stores payments, but the money was not there. As credit was tightened, but the money did not exist, a panic ensued. People rushed to recall their savings that only existed in paper, but banks could not handle the loans and began to fail.
Thus, the government turned to economic diplomacy to limit the magnitude of the economic crisis through the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Fearing further devastation, several politicians thought it was time to enact legislation to protect American companies and American jobs. For post-World War I America, the ideal way of doing this was through a set of tariffs, which would make international products more expensive than domestic ones, and therefore eliminating foreign competition. It was under this environment that Republican Senator Reed Smoot and Republican Representative Willis C. Hawley sought out to enact new tariffs, based on Herbert Hoover's promises of tariffs. These new tariffs would raise the prices of over 20,000 foreign agricultural and industrial goods to near record levels, only being slightly surpassed by the Tariff Act of 1828.
That year's election saw Republican candidate Herbert Hoover run against Democratic candidate L. Smith. Herbert Hoover won a resounding victory, receiving 58.2% of the popular vote. Hoover could attest his victory to the high regard many Americans had for Republicans following the roaring economic boom of the 1920s, and promises to continue the prosperity America enjoyed under Coolidge.
The election of 1928 laid the groundwork for the Smoot-Hawley Act. During his campaign, Hoover made pledges to engage in economic diplomacy that would assist American farmers by increasing agricultural tariffs. When Hoover won the 1928 election, he asked Congress to increase tariff rates for agricultural products and decrease industrial tariff rates, thus making good on his campaign promises.
Thus, the bill was first passed by the House of Representatives in May of 1929. Another version of the bill was then presented to the Senate, but by this time it had become more controversial as politicians and economists began to worry about its potential consequences in upsetting world trade. However, the bill was still passed by the Senate in March of 1930, but by a much narrower vote of 44 to 42. Even though both houses had approved the Smoot-Hawley bill, the debate was still strong, as demonstrated by a petition of 1,028 economists appealing to Hoover for him to veto the bill. Henry Ford called the bill an economic stupidity, and J.P. Morgan's chief executive Thomas Lamont said, "I almost went down on my knees to beg Herbert Hoover to veto the asinine Hawley-Smoot tariff." Hoover himself was somewhat opposed to the bill, as he thought it violated his philosophy of international cooperation. But despite the opposition, Hoover signed the bill into law on June 17, 1930.
Yet coming at a time of such economic instability, did the Hawley-Smoot tariff plunge the United States and the world further into the Great Depression? Or rather, did it live up to its intended purpose and safeguard fragile American industry and jobs from unfair competition? It is clear that while its proponents may have envisioned the tariff to be an instrument of relief to the battered stewards of commerce, this benefit was curtailed by the swift retaliation of foreign nations. Acting with clarity, some of the largest trading partners of the United States increased their own tariffs. In Canada, even a government that was deeply opposed to tariffs was forced to match the U.S. tariff increases. In a statement directed at the United States, Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King stated, "The countervailing duties are designed to give practical illustration to the United States of the desire of Canada to trade at all times on fair and equal terms. For the present, we raised the duties on these selected commodities to the level applied against Canadian exports of the same commodities by other countries. But at the same time, we tell our neighbor that we are ready in the future to consider trade on a reciprocal basis. However, this urgent call for tariff reduction went unanswered, and a wider trade war became inevitable. European nations such as Britain and France enacted their own retaliatory tariffs, and the result was a decline in American exports as well as imports. Thus, the volume of world trade experienced a sharp decline, enabling an even wider and deeper depression.
The Smoot-Hawley Act had an equally drastic effect on the American political landscape of the 1930s. Internationally, the bill came under fire from U.S. trading partners, and by September of 1929, Hoover had received notes of protest from 23 trading partners. Numerous boycotts were enacted against American goods, and key trading partners, including Canada, France, and Britain, raised rates against American products and forged new trade partnerships.
All the while, the economic crisis continued, and Americans braced for what would be the most challenging years ever faced by society. Over the next 10 years, families would struggle to deal with a 600% increase in unemployment and a 70% decrease in foreign trade. Worse yet, Germany reached a startling 43.8% unemployment. Even in Canada, an entire fifth of the labor force remained unemployed through the 1930s. Many breadwinners were shocked to lose their long-time jobs. Unable to secure even the lowest paying of jobs, most Americans resorted to unstable day labor. However, nothing was as devastating as the sensations of guilt experienced by American laborers. Despite the fact that the Great Depression was mostly caused by financial decisions, many continued to believe that their employment was their own fault. If with all the advantages I've had, I can't make a living, I'm just no good, I guess. The words of an unemployed Texas schoolteacher in 1933. In Britain, the masses responded with communist motivations. Frustrated with the lack of decisive leadership, Soviets advocated a government ran by experts rather than lords or politicians. Thus, many people joined the ranks of the Communist Party of Great Britain. Throughout the rest of Europe, people would make pleas for communism and fascism alike, as they felt capitalism had failed them once and for all.
Thankfully, the Smoot-Hawley Act was gradually repealed by the creation of multilateral trade agreements and gatherings such as the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in the 1950s, which had the effect of lessening global tariffs.
But has the world learned from the lessons of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff and the Great Depression? For the most part, the number of tariffs issued by the U.S. has decreased dramatically following the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in comparison to before it. International agreements, such as the North American Free Trade Agreement, created in 1994, continue to reduce global barriers to trade. Globalization has been a major reason for reducing the need for tariffs, as the entire world now has a close-knit economy. Even the slightest disturbance in the Middle East is enough to cause a surge in gas prices. Today, tariffs are used more as an assault on other nations' economies rather than as a defensive mechanism.
In one recent instance of economic diplomacy, the People's Republic of China has been accused of directly manipulating its currency, creating a tariff in effect, if not in name. By undervaluing its currency, China can make its goods cheaper and thus more competitive on the world market. The industries of other countries then suffer from this unfair market distortion and are unable to sustain exports or compete with Chinese imports.
The Smoot-Hawley Tariff has currently an amendment called the Currency Reform of Fair Trade Act 2010 going through Congress. It seeks to impose punitive tariffs on countries who artificially change the value of their currency for economic benefits.
In conclusion, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But whether you lived in America or Europe, the Smoot-Hawley Act was the worst of policies. Combined with the shortage of credit and overproduction of durable goods, the tariffs of 1930 strangled global commerce. Despite domestic and international backlash, Hoover resisted the debate, and world descended into depression. For the next 10 years, society struggled to cope with poverty and overnight destruction of their lives. As we progress into modern economy, we will surely encounter a myriad of crises, and the failings of the Smoot-Hawley Act will hopefully be immortalized in the wiser economic diplomacy of today.